The scythe blade caught the amber light of the harvest moon as it arced through the October air, splitting skull from spine with the wet crack of breaking kindling. Samuel Ridge's eyes went wide in the instant before his knees buckled, his blood pooling black between the cornstalks he'd forced others to tend for 23 merciless years. This is the story of how a single night of rage rewrote the fate of an entire mountain community, erasing a family from history and spawning legends that still whisper through the hollers of eastern Kentucky. Before we dive deeper, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story grips you like it should, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened on October 31st, 1852, in the shadow of Pine Mountain, defies everything we thought we knew about justice in the antebellum South. The Ridge family had ruled their slice of Appalachian wilderness like feudal lords since 1828, when Jeremiah Ridge first claimed 800 acres of bottomland along Troublesome Creek. Unlike the sprawling plantations of the Cotton South, the Ridge operation was intimate and brutal. 47 enslaved souls trapped in a valley where the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles through treacherous mountain passes. Jeremiah's son Samuel had inherited not just the land, but his father's particular brand of cruelty, one that treated human beings like draft animals to be worked until they dropped. The autumn of 1852 brought an unusually abundant harvest. Corn stood thick and golden in the bottomlands, while late tobacco hung heavy in the curing barns. But abundance meant longer days, shorter rations, and Samuel's increasing paranoia about meeting his shipping deadlines to the riverboat traders in Prestonsburg. The enslaved workers, men, women, and children ranging from 8 to 60 years old, found themselves laboring from before dawn until well past midnight, their bodies pushed beyond human endurance. Ezekiel, a blacksmith turned field hand after a failed escape attempt 3 years earlier, later told his story to a traveling minister who recorded it in a journal that survived the decades. According to Ezekiel's account, Samuel Ridge had implemented what he called harvest discipline, a system where anyone who collapsed from exhaustion received 10 lashes, and anyone who spoke without permission received 20. Food became so scarce that children were fainting in the fields, yet Samuel forbade hunting or foraging, claiming every hour must be devoted to bringing in the crops. The breaking point came on October 29th, when 8-year-old Charity collapsed while carrying water buckets to the tobacco barn. Samuel Ridge himself administered the punishment, using a leather strap that left the child unable to walk. That evening, as Charity lay dying in her mother's arms, something shifted in the quarters, a collective decision made without words, communicated through glances and the subtle positioning of bodies around the dying child. But here's where the documented history ends and the mystery begins. What exactly was discussed in those hushed conversations over the next 2 days? The Ridge family kept meticulous records of everything else: crop yields, weather patterns, even the breeding schedules of their livestock, yet not a single written account exists of what they observed in their enslaved workforce during those final 48 hours before their world ended in blood and screams. Martha's calloused fingers traced the outline of a corn knife hidden beneath her threadbare shawl, its weight both terrifying and reassuring, as she knelt beside little Charity's, still form in the flickering candlelight of the slave quarters. Understanding how 47 desperate people coordinated a revolt without leaving a single written trace reveals the sophisticated networks of resistance that existed even in the most isolated corners of the antebellum South. The quarters occupied a narrow strip of land between Troublesome Creek and the main house, consisting of 6 ramshackle cabins that housed entire families in spaces barely larger than modern prison cells. Martha, who served as both midwife and unofficial leader among the women, had spent 34 years watching children born into bondage, and 34 years perfecting the art of silent communication that kept communities alive under constant surveillance. According to the testimony Ezekiel later gave, the conspiracy began not with grand speeches or dramatic oaths, but with something far more subtle: the redistribution of work tools. On the morning of October 30th, Martha made her usual rounds distributing water and cornbread to the field hands, but this time she carried an additional burden: small farming implements that had mysteriously migrated from their usual storage places. A pruning hook tucked beneath young Thomas's pile of corn shucks. A billhook slipped under the water barrel where Isaac drew his morning ration. A corn knife positioned just so beside Rebecca's washing tub. The Ridge family maintained their wealth through a system called task labor. Each enslaved person received specific daily quotas that, once completed, theoretically granted them a few hours of personal time. But Samuel had perverted this system, setting impossible quotas that forced workers to labor past exhaustion just to avoid punishment. This October, with the exceptional harvest straining everyone beyond their limits, even the strongest men found themselves working 20-hour days. What Samuel failed to recognize was how his own obsession with efficiency had created the perfect conditions for organized resistance. The extended work hours meant that supervisors, his two adult sons, Jacob and William, were spread thin across 800 acres of fields and forest. More crucially, the harvest season brought all 47 enslaved people into close proximity for the first time all year, as everyone from house servants to field hands worked together bringing in the crops. The plan that emerged was elegantly simple: use Samuel's own schedule against him. Every evening at 9:45, Samuel made his final inspection rounds, walking a predetermined path from the main house through the tobacco barns, corn cribs, and finally to the slave quarters. This routine, maintained religiously for 4 years, had become so predictable that even the dogs knew to expect his footsteps at exactly 10:05 each night. But October 31st would be different. That morning, Martha had received word through channels that remain mysterious even today. Some say a coded message delivered by a traveling peddler. Others claim divine revelation that this would be their only chance. The Ridge family had arranged to transport their entire harvest to Prestonsburg on November 2nd, a journey that would require taking several of the strongest men as drivers and loaders, effectively scattering the community and making future resistance impossible. The enslaved community faced a calculation that haunts American history: submit to a lifetime of brutality or risk everything in a single moment of violence that would likely end in their deaths regardless of its success. Charity's lifeless body, still warm in her mother's arms, had made that calculation devastatingly clear. As the October sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows through the corn rows, each person in the fields received their final instructions through a system of gestures, hummed melodies, and carefully placed objects that would have appeared meaningless to any observer. The brilliance lay not in what was said, but in what remained unspoken, a conspiracy so thoroughly internalized that it could function without a single incriminating word. Yet something went wrong in those final hours before the harvest moon rose blood red over Pine Mountain. Something that would transform a carefully planned uprising into a massacre so thorough that it shocked even hardened frontier communities accustomed to violence. What happened when Samuel Ridge deviated from his nightly routine, arriving at the quarters a full 23 minutes early? The answer lies buried in the testimony of the only witness who survived what came next, and his account challenges everything historians thought they knew about that terrible October night. Samuel Ridge's leather boots crunched through frost-brittle leaves as he approached the slave quarters at 9:22 p.m., his brass pocket watch glinting in the moonlight, 23 minutes ahead of the schedule that had governed life and death on his plantation for 4 years. This deviation from routine would transform a coordinated uprising into a bloodbath that claimed 11 lives before the conspirators could even reach their hidden weapons. Martha stood frozen beside the water barrel where Isaac's billhook lay concealed, her heart hammering against her ribs as Samuel's lantern cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The plan had accounted for every variable, except the one now bearing down on them: their master's unpredictability. At 9:22, the hidden weapons remained scattered across 6 different locations. The designated lookouts were still positioning themselves along the creek path, and half the conspirators were inside the cabins, settling their children for what they'd hoped would be the last night of their bondage. "Ezekiel!" Samuel's voice cracked like a whip through the evening air. "Front and center. Now!" The blacksmith emerged from cabin 3, his massive frame silhouetted against the doorway, hands empty and visible, a gesture of submission that fooled no one who knew how to read the coiled tension in his shoulders. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, Martha caught sight of young Thomas reaching toward the corn shucks where his pruning hook waited. Samuel raised his lantern higher, scanning the faces that emerged from the cabins with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades reading rebellion in human expressions. Something in the air felt different tonight. The usual mixture of exhaustion and resignation had been replaced by an electric stillness that reminded him of the moments before summer storms broke over the mountains. "Where's Rebecca?" Samuel demanded, his gaze sweeping across the assembled group. "I didn't dismiss her from the house until 8:30. The question hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Rebecca had been assigned a crucial role in the uprising. Her position as head cook gave her access to the main house, where Samuel's hunting rifles rested in an unlocked cabinet just steps from his study. But she should have been here by now, weapons in hand, ready to distribute them among the conspirators. Isaac stepped forward, his weathered face a mask of careful neutrality. "She be tendin' to Miss Eleanor's headache, Master Ridge, brewin' up some willow bark tea." The lie rolled off Isaac's tongue with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on creative truth-telling. But Samuel's eyes narrowed, and Martha knew their leader had detected something amiss. In the antebellum South, masters developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when their human property harbored dangerous thoughts. It was a skill that meant the difference between maintaining control and facing revolt. Samuel set his lantern on a tree stump and drew closer to the assembled group, his boots echoing against the packed earth. "Funny thing about tonight," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Found a corn knife in my tobacco barn, right where it didn't belong." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Someone had moved too early, or perhaps Samuel's sons had discovered one of the hidden weapons during their own rounds. Either way, their carefully laid plans were unraveling with each passing second. "Now, I'm thinking," Samuel continued, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his belt. "Maybe some of you folks been getting ideas above your station. Maybe you forgot who owns who around here." That's when young Thomas made his fatal mistake. Instead of maintaining the submissive posture that might have salvaged the situation, the 16-year-old's eyes darted toward the corn shucks where his pruning hook waited. The movement lasted less than a heartbeat, but Samuel caught it with the predatory instincts of a man who'd built his fortune on reading human weakness. The plantation owner lunged toward the hiding spot, his lantern swinging wild arcs of light across the cabin walls. His fingers closed around the pruning hook's wooden handle just as Thomas dove forward in a desperate attempt to stop him. The collision sent both men tumbling into the dirt, Samuel's lantern shattering against a cabin wall and plunging the quarters into near-total darkness. In the confusion, Martha heard Isaac's voice boom across the compound. "Now, all of you, now." But now was too early, too scattered, too desperate. Half the weapons remained hidden, while the other half were in the wrong hands. Instead of the coordinated strike that might have succeeded, the uprising devolved into chaos as 47 people tried to adapt a months-old plan to a situation no one had anticipated. The sound that rose from the slave quarters that night, part war cry, part death wail, part prayer to whatever gods might be listening, would haunt the surrounding mountains for generations to come. Samuel Ridge's screams joined the cacophony as multiple hands seized him in the darkness. But they were not the screams of a man meeting swift justice. They were the prolonged agony of someone being torn apart by farming tools wielded by people who had endured decades of brutality and now found themselves with the power to return it tenfold. But in that moment of savage retribution, none of the conspirators noticed the small figure crouched behind the overturned water barrel, the one witness whose survival would ensure their story reached the outside world, and whose testimony would reveal the true horror of what happened when the harvest moon reached its peak. Who was this hidden observer, and why did their account differ so dramatically from every other version of the Ridge family massacre? The answer would emerge only after 3 days of searching revealed something that defied all logic about that blood-soaked October night. 7-year-old Benjamin Ridge pressed his small body deeper into the shadows behind the overturned water barrel, his white nightgown ghostly pale in the moonlight as his father's death screams echoed across the October landscape. The testimony of a plantation owner's child would become the most damning evidence against everything the antebellum South claimed to believe about the nature of slavery, bondage, and human dignity. Benjamin had snuck out of the main house, following a path he'd walked countless times before, the same route that led to Martha's cabin, where the enslaved woman had been secretly teaching him to read, using pages torn from discarded almanacs. His parents believed their youngest son was simply fascinated by the peculiar institution that formed the backbone of their wealth, never suspecting that Benjamin had formed genuine bonds of affection with the people they treated as livestock. From his hiding place, the boy watched Martha step into the circle of dying lantern light, a corn knife now gripped in her trembling hands. Her face, normally gentle when she helped him sound out difficult words, had transformed into something he'd never seen before. Not quite rage, not quite sorrow, but a terrible mixture of both that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside her chest. 23 years, Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above Samuel's weakening moans. 23 years of watching my baby sold away from me. Benjamin knew about Martha's children, 5 of them, scattered across 3 different states, when Samuel needed quick cash to cover gambling debts or poor crop yields. What he hadn't understood until this moment was the connection between those sales and the way Martha sometimes stared into the distance with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. The other conspirators formed a loose circle around Samuel's writhing form, their hidden weapons finally retrieved and gleaming in the scattered moonlight. But instead of finishing him quickly, they seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what they'd begun. 47 people who'd spent their entire lives following orders now faced a moment that required them to act without guidance, without permission, without any certainty about what would come next. Isaac spoke first, his deep voice carrying across the compound. The sons, Jacob and William, be comin' when they hear the commotion. As if summoned by his words, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the direction of the main house. Benjamin recognized the heavy tread of his 24-year-old brother Jacob, followed by the lighter, more hurried steps of 18-year-old William. Both young men had inherited their father's casual brutality, but neither possessed Samuel's cunning or his ability to sense danger before it materialized. Martha raised her corn knife, moonlight sliding along its curved blade like mercury. "Let 'em come," she said. "Tonight we finish what should have been finished long ago." The approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by Jacob's voice calling through the darkness. "Pa, what's all that ruckus down there?" Benjamin watched his brothers emerge into the clearing, Jacob carrying a rifle while William held a lantern that cast wild shadows across the scene. Their confident expressions changed to horror as they registered their father's mangled form surrounded by enslaved people, armed with farming tools that dripped black in the moonlight. "Jesus Christ," William breathed, his lantern trembling in his grip. "Pa, can you—" Isaac's billhook caught William in the throat before he could finish the sentence. dropping the youngest Ridge son in a spray of arterial blood that painted the cabin walls crimson. The lantern shattered against the ground, adding the stench of burning oil to the metallic smell of blood that already saturated the compound. Jacob raised his rifle, but 47 people moving with coordinated purpose proved faster than one panicked young man trying to aim in near total darkness. The weapon fired once, the muzzle flash illuminating faces twisted with decades of suppressed rage, before multiple hands dragged Jacob down into the churning mass of bodies. Benjamin bit his nightgown sleeve to keep from crying out as he watched his family, the only world he'd ever known, disappear beneath a tide of violence that seemed to transform the very air around him. The sounds that emerged from that writhing mass defied description. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that belonged to the space between civilization and chaos. But what happened next would haunt Benjamin Ridge for the remaining 63 years of his life. As the immediate frenzy of killing subsided, the enslaved people didn't celebrate or flee or even pause to catch their breath. Instead, they began to organize with an efficiency that suggested this moment had been planned down to the smallest detail. Martha issued commands in a voice that carried absolute authority. Ezekiel, you and Isaac drag the bodies to the creek. Rebecca, gather all the house goods worth carrying. Thomas, you hitch the wagon and load whatever supplies we can manage. Within 20 minutes, the compound had been transformed from a scene of chaotic violence into something resembling a military operation. The bodies disappeared into Troublesome Creek with weights tied around their ankles. Valuable items from the main house, silver, jewelry, Samuel's hidden strongbox, were loaded into the plantation's own wagon, along with supplies for a journey that would take them far from the Kentucky mountains. But as Benjamin watched the enslaved community prepare for their escape, he noticed something that would puzzle him for the rest of his life. They moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going, as if this night had been choreographed by someone with intimate knowledge of the surrounding wilderness and the routes that led to safety. The most chilling moment came when Martha walked directly to Benjamin's hiding place, her blood-stained hands reaching down to touch his trembling shoulder. "You gonna remember this night, child," she said softly, her voice gentle again, despite the carnage surrounding them. "But you gonna remember it true, not the way they'll want you to tell it." How did Martha know Benjamin was there? And what did she mean when she spoke about remembering the massacre true? The answer would emerge only when investigators discovered evidence that the Ridge family massacre was not a spontaneous uprising, but the final act in a conspiracy that reached far beyond the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Martha's bloodied fingers pressed a folded piece of paper into Benjamin's palm, the document still warm from her body heat, as wagon wheels creaked to life somewhere in the darkness beyond the smoldering remains of his family's compound. What Benjamin couldn't have understood at 7 years old was that he held in his trembling hands a piece of correspondence that would expose the Ridge family massacre as part of a coordinated network stretching from the Ohio River to the Gulf of Mexico. The paper bore a single line written in careful script. "When the harvest moon reaches its peak, the seeds of justice shall find fertile ground." Below the cryptic message, a crude map showed creek beds, mountain passes, and what appeared to be safe houses marked with tiny crosses extending northward through Virginia and into Pennsylvania. But most telling of all was the signature at the bottom. J.R., friend of the cause. The enslaved community moved through their final preparations with the precision of a military unit executing a long-rehearsed plan. Benjamin watched from his hiding spot as Rebecca emerged from the main house, carrying his mother's jewelry box alongside bundles of food that would sustain 47 people for weeks in the wilderness. Ezekiel had hitched the plantation's strongest horses to a wagon that groaned under the weight of supplies, tools, and whatever portable wealth the Ridge family had accumulated through decades of human bondage. But the most shocking revelation came when Martha pulled back a canvas tarp to reveal weapons that had never belonged to the plantation. Military-grade rifles, ammunition, and even a small cannon that must have been cached somewhere in the surrounding forest, months or even years in advance. This was no spontaneous uprising born of desperation. It was the culmination of a sophisticated operation that had been planned by people with resources, connections, and detailed knowledge of how to move large groups through hostile territory. At 11:47 p.m., just as the harvest moon reached its zenith, a low whistle echoed across Troublesome Creek from the direction of Pine Mountain. Martha answered with a matching call, and within minutes, shadowy figures emerged from the tree-lined men and women Benjamin had never seen before, all carrying rifles and moving with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to operating in darkness. The leader was a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair, who spoke in the clipped accent of someone educated far from these Kentucky mountains. "Martha Washington Johnson," he said, using a full name that Benjamin had never heard before. "Are you ready to claim your freedom?" "We've been ready since the day we was born," Martha replied, but her voice carried a formality that suggested this meeting represented far more than a simple rescue operation. The gray-haired man gestured toward the wagon and the assembled enslaved people. 47 souls, as promised. The route north is clear, but you'll need to reach the Clinch River crossing before dawn on November 2nd. Our contacts in Prestonsburg will have supplies waiting, but they can't hold position longer than 24 hours. Benjamin's child mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. These strangers spoke about his family's human property as if they were soldiers in an army, discussing logistics and timetables with the efficiency of military planners. More disturbing still, they seemed to know details about the plantation's operations that only someone with intimate access could have provided. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Someone within the Ridge family's inner circle had been feeding information to these abolitionists for months, possibly years. Someone had provided detailed maps of the property, schedules of his father's movements, and intelligence about the best time to strike when the entire enslaved community would be gathered for harvest. As the mysterious rescuers began helping people into wagons and organizing them for the journey north, Benjamin noticed Martha scanning the compound as if looking for something or someone she'd expected to find. Her gaze lingered on the main house, its windows now dark and empty, before settling on the shadows where Benjamin crouched. "Child gonna need tendin'," she said to the gray-haired leader, her voice carrying that strange gentleness she'd always shown him. "Can't leave him here to starve, and can't take him with us neither." The man followed her gaze to Benjamin's hiding spot, his weathered face creasing with what might have been sympathy or calculation. "The boy's seen everything, hasn't he?" "Every last bit," Martha confirmed. "Question is, what we gonna do about it?" Benjamin felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized his life now hung in the balance of a conversation between people who had just murdered his entire family. The same hands that had shown him kindness while teaching him to read had wielded farming tools with deadly efficiency less than an hour ago. The same voice that had whispered gentle encouragements as he struggled with difficult words now discussed his fate as if he were a problem to be solved, rather than a terrified child. The gray-haired man knelt beside Benjamin's hiding place, his eyes surprisingly gentle despite the gravity of the situation. "What's your name, son?" "Benjamin," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own heartbeat. "Benjamin, do you understand what happened here tonight?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the extinguished lanterns. Benjamin knew that his answer would determine whether he lived or died, whether he became another victim of this night's violence or something else entirely. But what could a 7-year-old boy possibly say that would satisfy people who had just orchestrated the complete destruction of everything he'd ever known? The rescue party began moving toward the tree line, their mission apparently complete, but Martha lingered beside the overturned water barrel where Benjamin still crouched in his blood-stained nightgown. What she whispered in his ear during those final moments would haunt Benjamin Ridge for the rest of his life, and her words contained a secret that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about the Underground Railroad's operations in eastern Kentucky. But Martha's revelation was nothing compared to what investigators would discover 3 days later when they found evidence that someone had been living in the Ridge family's root cellar for weeks before the massacre, someone whose identity would shake the foundations of antebellum society. Sheriff Marcus Doyle's lantern beam illuminated a makeshift bed of corn shucks and stolen blankets tucked into the furthest corner of the Ridge family's root cellar, alongside a leather satchel containing enough correspondence to hang a dozen abolitionists from Virginia to Ohio. The discovery that someone had been living beneath Samuel Ridge's own house for nearly 2 months before the massacre revealed a betrayal so intimate that it challenged every assumption about loyalty, blood, and the bonds that supposedly held Southern society together. Deputy Coleman lifted the satchel with trembling hands, recognizing immediately that its contents represented evidence of treason that reached far beyond a simple slave uprising. The letters inside, written in multiple hands but coordinated with military precision, detailed not just the Ridge family massacre, but dozens of similar operations planned across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Routes were mapped, safe houses identified, and local contacts named with the thoroughness of a military campaign designed to systematically destroy the institution of slavery from within. But the signature at the bottom of each letter made Deputy Coleman's blood run cold. J.R. The same initials that appeared on the mysterious document Martha had pressed into young Benjamin's palm 3 nights earlier. "Sheriff," Coleman called, his voice tight with disbelief. "You need to see this." Doyle descended into the root cellar, his boots splashing through puddles of water that had seeped through the stone walls during the recent rains. The space smelled of damp earth and something else, the lingering scent of expensive tobacco that belonged to only one brand sold in the region. Samuel Ridge had been particular about his tobacco, importing it specially from Richmond at considerable expense. And he'd never shared it with anyone except family members and the most honored guests. The sheriff's examination of the makeshift living space revealed luxuries that no common abolitionist could have afforded. Silk handkerchiefs, a gold pocket watch, leather-bound books, and a silver hip flask engraved with the Ridge family crest. Most damning of all was a small oil painting that had been carefully removed from its frame in the main house. A portrait of Samuel Ridge's deceased brother, Jacob Sr., who had died in a hunting accident 12 years earlier. Jesus Christ Almighty, Sheriff Doyle breathed as the implications crashed over him like a mountain avalanche. It ain't some outside agitator been orchestrating this whole thing. The correspondence told a story that defied everything the surrounding community believed about the Ridge family massacre. The mysterious J.R. was not a stranger who had infiltrated the plantation, but someone with intimate knowledge of its operations, detailed access to its financial records, and the authority to move freely through areas that would have been off-limits to any outsider. More disturbing still, the letters revealed that this betrayal had been years in the making, with methodical preparation that included caching weapons, establishing communication networks, and recruiting local sympathizers throughout eastern Kentucky. One letter, dated September 15, 1852, contained instructions that made Deputy Coleman's hands shake as he read, "Samuel must not suspect until the final moment. Continue attending family dinners and participating in local social functions. Your position of trust remains our greatest advantage in ensuring the operation's success." Another, dated October 10th, provided intelligence that could only have come from someone present during private family conversations. Plans to transport the entire harvest on November 20, requiring most able-bodied men as drivers. This represents our optimal window for complete liberation of all souls currently held in bondage. But the most shocking revelation came in a letter dated October 28th, just 3 days before the massacre. Young Benjamin's education progresses well under M's tutelage. The child possesses a gentle heart that may serve our cause in years to come. Ensure his safety during the upcoming operation. He will be our witness to the justice we bring to this cursed family." Sheriff Doyle sat heavily on a wooden crate, his mind struggling to process evidence that suggested the Ridge family massacre had been orchestrated by someone who shared their blood, their name, and their supposed commitment to the institution of slavery. The betrayal was so profound that it threatened to unravel the social fabric of every plantation community in the region if word spread that even family members could turn against their own kin in service of abolition. What trust could any slave owner place in those closest to them? The final piece of the puzzle lay at the bottom of the satchel. A detailed map of underground railroad routes extending from eastern Kentucky through Virginia, Pennsylvania, and ultimately to Canada. But this was no ordinary map. It contained information that could only have been gathered through years of careful intelligence work, including the names of local sympathizers, safe house locations, and even the schedules of friendly riverboat captains willing to transport escaping slaves across the Ohio River. Most disturbing of all, the map included notations in Samuel Ridge's own handwriting corrections and updates that suggested he had been unknowingly contributing to his own destruction through casual conversations with someone he trusted implicitly. Deputy Coleman's voice cracked as he read the final entry in the correspondence. The seeds planted in 1847 have finally borne fruit. Samuel's cruelty toward his human property has provided the moral justification we needed, while his trust in family has provided the practical access required for success. When history judges this night, let it be recorded that justice came not from outside agitators, but from the conscience of those who knew his crimes most intimately. The signature beneath these words was not the cryptic J.R. that had appeared on every other document, but a full name that made both lawmen question everything they thought they knew about loyalty, family, and the true nature of the conflict tearing their nation apart. Who was this family member whose betrayal had orchestrated the complete destruction of the Ridge plantation, and how had they managed to hide their true allegiances for over 5 years while living under Samuel Ridge's own roof? The answer would emerge only when investigators finally tracked down 7-year-old Benjamin Ridge, whose testimony about that terrible October night would reveal the most shocking truth of all, one that would force an entire community to confront the possibility that the greatest threats to their way of life came not from distant abolitionists, but from the people they trusted most. Benjamin Ridge's 7-year-old finger trembled as he pointed toward the daguerreotype on Sheriff Doyle's desk, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke the name that would rewrite everything the community thought they knew about the Ridge family massacre. "That's Uncle Jacob. He comes to visit sometimes." The revelation that Jacob Ridge Sr. had faked his own death 12 years earlier to become one of the Underground Railroad's most effective operatives transformed a local tragedy into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Southern society. The daguerreotype showed a man whose supposed death in 1840 had been mourned by the entire community, Samuel Ridge's older brother, a respected plantation owner who had reportedly drowned in the Kentucky River during a hunting expedition. But Benjamin's matter-of-fact identification shattered the official narrative, revealing instead a carefully orchestrated deception that had allowed Jacob to operate as an abolitionist agent while maintaining access to his family's plantation and the intelligence it provided. Sheriff Doyle leaned forward, his weathered face grave as he processed the implications. "Son, when did you last see your Uncle Jacob?" "2 days before the bad night," Benjamin replied, his child's vocabulary struggling to encompass the horror he'd witnessed. "He was in the root cellar with Martha. They was looking at papers and whispering about the harvest moon." The pieces of the puzzle crashed together with devastating clarity. Jacob Ridge had spent 12 years building an identity as a martyred Southern gentleman, while secretly coordinating slave rescues across 3 states. His fake death had provided the perfect cover. No one questioned a ghost's movements, and his intimate knowledge of plantation operations made him invaluable to the Underground Railroad's intelligence network. Deputy Coleman spread the seized correspondence across the sheriff's desk, highlighting passages that now made perfect sense. "Look here," he said, pointing to a letter dated March 10th, 1852. J.R. writes about maintaining the family facade, while Samuel's brutality provides necessary justification for our actions. He's been waiting for his brother to become cruel enough to justify what he had planned. The correspondence revealed a brother's calculated manipulation, stretching back years. Jacob had deliberately encouraged Samuel's worst impulses, providing subtle suggestions that increased the plantation's brutality while appearing to support the institution of slavery. When Samuel implemented his harvest discipline system, it was based on techniques Jacob had described as successful at neighboring plantations. When Samuel decided to separate Martha from her children through strategic sales, Jacob had provided the contacts to ensure those sales happened under the most traumatic circumstances possible. Every cruelty that had driven the enslaved community to their breaking point had been carefully orchestrated by a man who shared Samuel's blood but had rejected everything their family represented. Jacob Ridge had transformed his brother into a monster, then used that monstrosity to justify the massacre that freed 47 people from bondage. Benjamin's testimony revealed the true scope of Jacob's deception. The supposedly dead brother had been visiting the plantation regularly for years, always arriving at night and leaving before dawn, using childhood knowledge of secret passages and hiding places to avoid detection. The enslaved community had known of his presence. Martha had been his primary contact, but his identity remained hidden from Samuel and his sons, until the night everything came to its violent conclusion. Uncle Jacob told me once that sometimes good people gotta pretend to be bad people to fight the real bad people, Benjamin said, his young voice struggling with concepts that challenged the moral framework of his entire world. I didn't understand what he meant till the bad night happened. The investigation revealed that Jacob's fake death had been accomplished with help from Dr. Matthias Crane, a physician sympathetic to abolitionist causes who had pronounced Jacob drowned after a carefully staged accident. The body recovered from the Kentucky River had been a homeless drifter who had died of natural causes, dressed in Jacob's clothes and weighted down to prevent close examination. Meanwhile, Jacob had disappeared into the Underground Railroad network, eventually emerging as one of its most effective coordinators. Sheriff Doyle faced an impossible dilemma. The evidence of Jacob Ridge's survival and his role in coordinating the massacre was overwhelming, but revealing the truth would expose the Underground Railroad's operations throughout the region and potentially compromise dozens of ongoing rescue efforts. More problematically, it would demonstrate that the institution of slavery was vulnerable to betrayal from within the very families that profited from it, a revelation that could destabilize every plantation community in Kentucky. The decision to suppress the investigation came from authorities far above Sheriff Doyle's jurisdiction. Within a week, federal marshals arrived to confiscate all evidence related to the Ridge family massacre. The official report attributed the killings to outside agitators who had subsequently disappeared into the wilderness, with no mention of the sophisticated network that had made the operation possible. Benjamin Ridge was placed in the custody of distant relatives in Tennessee, his testimony dismissed as the confused memories of a traumatized child. The root cellar was sealed, the correspondence destroyed, and the daguerreotype that had revealed Jacob's survival mysteriously vanished from the sheriff's office. But stories have a way of surviving even the most determined efforts at suppression. Years later, as the Civil War raged across the same Kentucky mountains where the Ridge family had met their violent end, veterans would speak in hushed tones about a mysterious figure known only as the Ghost, who seemed to know Confederate troop movements before they happened, and whose intelligence consistently helped Union forces stay one step ahead of Southern armies. Some claimed this ghost was the spirit of Jacob Ridge, still fighting the war he'd begun in 1852. Others insisted he was very much alive, coordinating networks of spies and saboteurs from hidden bases in the Appalachian wilderness. Either way, his legacy lived on in the freedom of 47 people who had vanished into the October fog and were never seen in bondage again. The truth about what happened on that harvest moon night in 1852 remains buried in sealed archives and suppressed testimonies, but its echoes continue to resonate through American history, a reminder that the greatest threats to oppression often come not from outside enemies, but from the consciences of those who know its true cost most intimately. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.